I've wet all around the edges. I haven't wet the central area because I don't really need to, but that's still wet. So I'm just about to mix up a neutral ground out of browns, and there'll be a little bit of blue in there, maybe some green. So I'm exaggerating the colour. Don't forget these colours will actually dry a bit lighter, and don't forget about it bleeding into the subject there because it'll be quite soft and you can paint over the top of that. So we're getting a nice soft wash in the background. I'm just going to add a little bit more. It's not quite dry, but I'm going to add a little bit more darkness here, which will be nice and soft. Still dry, a little paler than this. So if you work into it while it's partially dry, it's just allowing you to control that just a tiny little bit more for the shadows. So I'm introducing some blues, possibly greens, just to exaggerate the colour a little bit to make quite a nice interesting backdrop to the image. And then these can be sharpened a little bit closer to the subject later on when it's fully dry. And if you want to try and control some of this blur out, if it's getting a bit much for you, just get a tissue and just take the edges off, but just be careful that you barely touch, otherwise it's just going to look a bit patchy. But it is possible just to stop it from coming out too far. So now you either let it dry on its own, or probably safe to get a hairdryer on that now. Now it's your first wash over for the first wash of the objects. Now just leave a few highlights on in various little bits. We can take some more highlights away later. So remember, this is just the first, missed a shadow there, the first pass, as it were, of colour, and then you'll be building that colour up. We need to get a base colour down first. So each time I'm putting a different colour onto the pebbles, I'm actually just drying it in between so that the colour of the pebble doesn't bleed with the next different colour of the pebble. So if you want a separation between colour and you don't want them to bleed, so put that one down first, then I've dried it, and then I put this middle one down, and then finally I've got the colour of the pebbles on top. Remember, this is just the first wash of pale colour, so more detail will go in after that's dry. It's important to remember it's dry in between so that you don't disturb the colour that's underneath it. So I'm just going to draw in any detail that's been lost, just to remind me of where I'm going with each of the objects here, any key things that have disappeared during the painting process, just a rough indication of where some of the lines go, some of the key things that I'll need to follow when I'm painting next. So it's always worth doing this in between. I think most of it's actually there, but things like this line is a very clear shape that needs to be followed, and it's getting a bit confused here, so I'll just redraw that back in just to remind me what's happening. And then hopefully that line won't show as I'm painting. It'll just be a guide for me. So I'm going to work pebble by pebble now, building up colour till I'm happy with the depth of tone that I've got there. And as I'm going along, I can do things like add a little bit of texture in either the ways that I've told you, with some splattering or sponging, or you could dip into some alternative colours straight from your palette, just to add some flecks of different colour like this while it's still wet as you're moving along. And a lot of this is imagined colour, but once we blend it with some water like in between like this, it's going to give a nice mottled texture. So you can build up some interest in each of the stones and make sure each of the stones looks suitably different from the next one. There's a little bit of contrast there. You can use a little bit of dry brush technique just to add some detail as well. So put the paint on your brush, but just work it off a little bit first before you, with the tissue, just paint down until it's like this, very dry, and then you can add some mark making onto your work that way. Just experiment with it a little bit first, get the marks that you want. It's quite good for rocks and stones. It's got a gritty graininess to it once the paint picks up on the paper. So a little bit seems to go quite a long way. So it stops these stones from looking so flat, and then we can add some highlights later. So pick the stones that have a similar feel and treat them in a similar way. These ones are a little smoother on the top, so I'll do something different with those. And these ones are a little dark, I need a bit more colour building up on those. I'm going to work on the shells in the same way, just building up in colour and a little bit of dry brush texture. So sort of finding the shadows really. So this one's quite rounded, it's quite weathered. So a lot smoother on this side, and certainly here it's very smooth, and maybe a little scratchy on the top here. So just try and compare textures with the objects that you're working with. Just if you look at a texture, just try and imagine how you can represent that texture with the techniques that you've been learning. I'm going to add some texture by a method called scraffito, which is basically scratching off certain areas. Now you can use something like an old nail file if it's coarse enough to scratch along and reveal some of the textured grain of the paper. A scalpel or a craft knife is quite useful for more particular lines. So what I'm going to do is just very carefully just scratch off some of those lines which appear over these stones. And because it's scratching off with this nice texture, and it's just sort of helping to sort of give a more believable surface finish to this stone. So work away, scratching at various different areas until you get the effect that you want. Obviously it's going to work better in darker sections as it's lifting the paint and revealing the white paper underneath. So think of the areas of highlight at the front here of these stones. Definitely giving a bit more of a three-dimensional feel to the stones there. You can also do that on the shells. Sorry about the camera shaking a bit. So if you've got some textured out, remember to clean the sandpaper first. Don't go too mad, just work into the areas where it's really going to make a big difference to the depth of the image. Finally, I'm going to sharpen up any areas of much more strong shadow. So we've got soft shadow, which is like an outer shadow, and then we've got like a sharper shadow which appears slightly closer, because I was using two lamps, so basically it's causing like a two shadow effect, but all of these shadows are helping to suggest the form, so we must include them. So you just got like a much darker shadow closer to the object, and this will just pull that forward. So once you've worked all the way around on this and put in any white highlights that you'd just like to put in with some white gouache or acrylic, and then that will be almost done. Just exaggerate any little shadows that you want to and details with some coloured pencil.